3 all told that committed suicide. And different ones said, oh, that was just a money grab. Well, they wouldn't have, if it had been a money grab, they wouldn't have operated that way, would they?
No, it looked like they took it very seriously.
Yeah.
How long could the area supply such a drain on their woods, is what that was going?
They were shipping stuff in from Tucker Lake all the while too, but that come by cars.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know where it was coming, that is, how many was involved there, but it was just bought for so much apart.
In other words, what I'm saying is, would the area have been able to sustain that much drain on their resources for more than 20, 25 years? Or?
I don't think it would have, but at that time there was a terrific amount of land in the forest on the Adirondacks. Now there's millions of acres up there that you can't cut anything on. So it's a little different situation then than it would be now. And so it's, of course, down around Syracuse, the Boer Lumber Company fellows tell me that timber grows a lot faster down around Syracuse than it does on Tug Hill.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, they sat right there when they told me.
Mm-hmm.
And but it's had a lot of experience in there, and some of that was stripped because they took the chemical wood up there to river and they cut it 4-foot lengths on the hill with the tops. And when they took everything down to 4 inches, a lot of places there wasn't anything left. And I could have a picture, but I'd have to go to get it. As I had a picture of a pile of chemical wood there that must have had, well, 2,000 cord in it, I guess. And I gave it to the fellow that bought the land afterward for taxes.
Mm-hmm.
And I kind of wish now I had that picture.
Mm-hmm.
I stopped to see him last summer, and he wasn't there. He was in Florida, I believe, but his brother was there, and he said that his other brother had the picture, but I never been back to see if I could get it.
Mm-hmm.
Probably couldn't, but I might be able to get it long enough to make a copy of it.
Well, it sounds like the company was pretty efficient to the extent that they used everything but the twigs and the leaves, like some of these slaughterhouses say they use everything but the pig squeal.
But it couldn't be much more efficient, I don't think, as far as the company was concerned. And the men were working to put that much into this thing. And we started, I think it was the 7th of May, and the 1st of June the following year they were in operation. And I hired out to work on the carriage, but I quit them and went to work for N.W. Salmons the day the mill started for 25 cents a day more.
And what were the average wages that were paid in those days?
$22.50 a week.
That's how long a week, how many hours?
That's 10 hours a day, would be 60 hours.
6 days a week.
What they did though, they quit an hour early, an hour early on the end of the week, because they went to work 10 minutes to 1 each day, and then that gave them an extra hour, and they quit an hour early on Saturday.
Cut their noon hour off 10 minutes so they get that extra hour, so they still had 60 hours a weekend.
That's right. Things were, at that time, we hadn't been married very long, and bread was 8 cents a loaf. And we'd been buying our bread, and when they raised it to 10 cents a loaf, I said, you're going to start making bread, because I said, I'm not going to pay any 10 cents a loaf for a loaf of bread. Well, I found out that she didn't understand all the marriage vows, because we were buying bread right now, some of it. And so it's a little bit different prices of material was too.
Uh-huh.
See, there was something else that I was thinking of that I had. There was bread, flour. Flour come in these big bags at that time, 98-pound sacks. Well, then they had a 49.5-pound sack, paper sack that was. And the others were the cloth sack. And then the pastry flours come in a 24.25-pound sack. And but as far as these little bags of flour you can go and buy in the stores now, 10-pound sacks and like that, that was unheard of at that time. I can't remember what the price of that was, but we did, when I after went to work at the feed mill, they sold quite a lot of it out of the mill there.
Mm-hmm. You had a story about those flour sacks that was interesting.
Well, yes, I was kind of thinking of that. I guess it'd be a pretty good place for it. After I went to work for M.W. Salmons, I was running the gas station, and it come a sharp cold spell in the fall, turned cold overnight, and they had quite a lot of coal to deliver, and they didn't get it all delivered. And this one family didn't have any coal, and the boss asked me if I would take about 100 pounds. It came in canvas bags. That is, we filled the canvas bags and handles on them, and I wanted to take one of those down to this family, and so they'd have coal enough till the next day. So I took it down there, and the woman was working in the garden. It was stooped over, and as I drove up there, the wind blew her dress right up over her shoulders, and across her butt it said, "Pillsbury's best."
Back to Keystone, you were telling about they're building a charcoal shed.
Yes, they built a charcoal shed there, and in that shed they put all their charcoal after it was sure the fire was out. They put it in this charcoal shed, and they bagged it and shipped it to different areas by train. Mm-hmm. It wasn't exactly a white-collar job. In fact, you couldn't tell whether they were black or white when it came time to go home. Mm-hmm. But they did ship a lot of that in bags, charcoal bags.
Now, this was used for what, the charcoal?
Oh, for grills and things of that nature.
Mm-hmm.
Probably 24-pound bags and up to 100 something. Mm-hmm. Well, not 100, because 100 would be an enormous big bag of charcoal. Mm-hmm. But there were, some of them were as high as 24.5-pound bags. Mm-hmm. And mostly was that one size. Maybe there was some of them 50. I never worked there, but I used to see them. But there was acetic acid and that stuff. They had a market for that until the Depression. Mm-hmm. And that really slapped them hard. There was one thing about the land on the hill. A lot of that land that I bought on the hill, I bought for taxes. And I think there's 202 acres that I bought that I paid $22.50 for. That was the first lot, I guess, was lot 4. I paid $600 for that, but that was virgin timber. That was spruce and everything was on that. Mm-hmm. But I bid it in for taxes. I had worked up there a while with the surveyors, and I knew pretty much where the jobbers were when they went out of business. And so I knew which lot to buy. Mm-hmm. Because they figured they kept all the lots that still had timber on them. But the ones that was questionable, they'd let those go back for taxes. And so there was a lot of it I had a little insight on as far as which ones to pick up. Mm-hmm. The first one that I bought for $22.50 was for the place to hunt, and that was the nearest, about near the middle between Montague and Osceola, Clearance. Mm-hmm. I still have it.
You mentioned where the Monteola got its name from is.
Well, the Monteola got its name when they put the railroad in. there was several, there was a few camps, and there was a log, lumber outfit and logging outfit in there. And that was just about on the line, town line between Osceola and Monteola. And so they called it Monteola. Now afterwards, there was a couple of spurs in there where they turned their railroad cars, their trains around. And they called that one Camelwood, the first one. And that was just before you got to Monteola. Mm-hmm. And that was a good, flat, kind of a flat piece of land. And, but the reason they called it Camelwood was because the Campbell and Dexter owned it, mm-hmm. or had owned it before when the railroad was being built. Mm-hmm. Well, then the next one, they went up the track a few miles, and they built another spur. And they called that one New Camelwood, and the other one they called Old Camelwood. Mm-hmm. Well, I worked in the woods up there one winter, and at that time, and the fellow that was tending the tote store kind of goofed up a little bit and didn't keep the fires going, and they sent him on the walk, and they had put me in the tote store, and I stayed there the rest of the winter. And but I shoveled snow off the skidways when I first went up by my brother. But there was 8 foot of snow on the skidways at that time. There was a lot of Frenchmen in there, and also quite a few Polish people there working. Mm-hmm. But French Canadians, there was a lot of those. Mm-hmm. And they had quite a lot of, they'd get up on a pile of logs, and instead of shoving the ends of the logs out first, they'd get up and pile all that snow just off the logs, and then they had to shovel it all up over the top. Well, my brother and I didn't do it that way, and I think we accomplished a little more than they did. But I didn't criticize them as far as that was concerned.
Well, you mentioned that your dad was working in the mill until the mill shut down in the fall after the cut was blocked shut with snow. Did your dad used to work in the woods on the cutting crews then the rest of the winter?
No, he never did. No, he worked in the, well, there was always repairing in the mill that he did that when he was working there. After the Keystone came, he developed pneumonia. It was in the summer. And we went, took him down to Utica. You had to have a lung tap. Volvic was the doctor. Mm-hmm. I helped him. I helped the doctor tap his lung. And doctor says, "Didn't hurt a bit, did it?" "To hell it didn't," he says. But there's only one thing that I know of on that way to Utica and back that's still there. That is, I've noticed it a lot. And that's as you go south of Potter's Corners. There's a little graveyard on the right. And just after you can leave that graveyard, there's a culvert across the road that used to heave up in the spring of the year with the frost, and it does the same thing this year too. Mm-hmm. It never has been found a way, or they haven't tried to correct that condition. Mm-hmm. But it's, as you look back, there's a lot of things that have changed.
Of a different outfit. Elwin, can you tell us about this?
Well, that's a paper company. It was called, they manufactured paper boxes, but they were not, at that time, corrugated boxes. They were just cardboard. Mm-hmm. And they were thicker quite a lot. And later on, after making furniture, they went to making paper boxes. Mm-hmm. But they operated all winter long.
And this was where, in Glenfield?
It's still here, right down here, back of the hardware store.
Mm-hmm. And what's it used for now?
Well, it's used right now for making, well, the Beaverite company own it now, mm-hmm. and they make different things. They have made different things. They made filters for I don't really know. They
Nice.
make indexes for and things of that nature. And I don't really know just what they are making right now. But they vary a little bit, but they've been steady work there ever since they took over. There was one thing that I did want to add about the Monteola.
Mhm.
When they built that railroad in under the bridge under the New York Central Railroad,
Mhm.
they had to fire little boilers to keep that from freezing. It was bitter cold, and they had to, when they started pouring the fuel, the concrete, they had to continue to pour till it was finished.
Mhm.
And there was one fellow there that worked 60 hours straight. They called him Peaches. I don't know what his name was, but he hollered and yelled to keep himself awake. He'd stand up there, he counted the number of loads of, wheelbarrow loads of stuff that dumped into each mixer.
Uh-huh.
That was his job. And there was another fellow that worked 54 hours straight on that job.
Oh, you're the fellow that worked 54 hours. And how did you stay awake?
Well, I was pretty much in a trance at that time, but we did finish the job, pouring the cement.
Uh-huh.
But it was more or less in a trance all the while. But they had, it was bitter cold, and it depended on cars to get to work, and a lot of those cars wouldn't start.
Mhm.
So they'd come along and ask if they, different ones, if they would work until somebody came to take their place. Well, there was two of us that they didn't take our place, and we stayed there until the job was bored. But we had quite a lot of work there. But they had, I think it was a remarkable job that they did. As far as the paper was concerned, it's been a very reliable mill. But during the war, when they started making corrugated boxes, they moved to Utica, and that plant was idle. Well, then later on, about the time I got out of the Army, they had come back and were making boxes or indexes and things like that here at the paper. And that is still in operation. And that's a year-round deal as far as that's concerned. Where the others didn't operate all winter, and that is the sawmills didn't operate all winter because they couldn't get logs enough in there fast enough at the time to do that. On the carriage, there was two fellows came up from Utica, and they wanted to get samples of sawdust from different kinds of logs. There's beech, birch, and maple. They were the most of them, and then there was anything that come through. And I don't really know how they did that. It went into this big hopper and under the bandsaws, but somebody must have told them what kind of log they were sawing, so they could get these different samples. And they were going to make artificial silk. And I think that was rayon, probably. I never knew. But I did ask them what they were going to do with it.
And when was this?
Well, that was in 26, I think, as I recall, in 1926. They had a different, at that time there was, most of their silk came from Japan. And when they loaded the trains on the west coast, they had an open track from there to New York City. And they had a detective in each car. And they never stopped from the time they left. Well, there's places where they took water on the fly, they called it. They dropped something down and there was a trough in the middle of the car track, and the speed would fill the water tank. And what little bit they stopped was very little, just enough to dump the coal in and get going again.
That was the silk trains.
That was the silk train. And but after that, they started making this artificial silk, and they kind of did away with those. But they came through Canada, and they crossed up on the St. Lawrence somewhere with the trains.
Mhm.
And they came through Glenfield, and they usually pull through here about midnight.
Mhm.
And they never stopped, only just for a very minute or two,
Mhm.
all the way through New York City.
Because silk was so much in demand and so
Mhm.
expensive.
Called it the Midnight Flyer or something.
What's that?
Called it the Midnight Flyer.
Yeah, no, they call it a silk tree.
Well,
Well, there was a flyer came through from Ogdensburg. They called the Midnight Flyer. In fact, when I was in the hospital, I came home on that flyer. And they just let me off, stopped long enough, let me off, and then went again.
Mhm.
That was about midnight or shortly after, too.
Mhm.
But,
Was there much rail traffic here?
oh, a lot of it. Yeah, compared to the roads, you know, that we didn't have a lot of state roads and that stuff those days. And the truckers, well, after a while, the railroad started delivering a lot of their less carload lots with with a ton and a half truck in different areas.
Mhm.
And that kind of actually took a lot of the business away from their own railroad, and eventually they didn't have it. But there was, well, there's quite a lot of memories going into some of this. But the land that I bought on the hill, I owned 1,900 acres up there at one time. And I don't think I lost any money on any of it.
Mhm.
But she's traveled a good many miles with me up there. And I think we've enjoyed it. There's different things that we did. One of the things, we carried beaver in there. There was no beaver on Tug Hill.
Mhm.
And whether that was a good idea or not, I don't know yet. But we carried them in on our back the second day of July.
Where'd you get the beaver?
Well, they were caught in the Carthage Reservoir. And the trapper was staying over here at Timber Lodge. And I said, I'd like to get 2 or 3 of those beaver, take on the hill. And he brought me 3 beaver, I think it was 3, Saturday afternoon. And I put them in the cellar in the store. I put one of them in a barrel and 2 of them in brine sacks. Well, it was a barrel that had pipe fittings in. And he chewed out of that barrel in less than a half an hour. So then I put him in a brine sack, and he was there in the morning.
Mhm.
And we carried him up there the second day of July, I believe it was. And when we got up there, why, we had 3 miles to carry him then, get him down to where I wanted to put him, on Grindstone Creek. And so on the way down, this beaver, I had the biggest one, he weighed about 50 pounds. And he got his head out of the brine sack, but he sat there in the sack with his head right side of mine and rode for the last mile right in that way. And when we turned them loose, they went out in the water and they just flattened themselves right out. And as though they just loved it and they didn't care whether they ever moved again or not.
Mhm.
But there's one time there was 26 beaver dams on my land up there.
Mhm.
And I never saw such fishing in my life. At that time, it was lucky to get a trout that was 5 or 6 inches long. But by flooding that amount of land, they got a lot more feed.
Mhm.
And I never saw landy fishing like it, and I never will again, because now we've got some acid water too to contend with. But that was really a beautiful time to fish up on Tug Hill. Are we ready? Well, Bill McCarthy was connected with the DEC in some way, and he got them to change the length of the trout to 7 inches. Well, there was so many small trout that they didn't get feed enough to get to 7 inches long. You could fish all day and you wouldn't catch one much over 5 or 5 and a half.
Mhm.
Well, about that time I was in the Fish and Wildlife.
Mhm.
And I tried to get them, tell them that they didn't get food enough. And after a while, they took trout one fall out of Smith Brook over to Osceola and took them down to the hatchery in Rome. And they were 10.5 inches long in the spring. Well, then they changed it to 10 trout of any length. Well, about that time is when we put the beaver in up there. But there was nothing to get 10 or 12-inch trout. But they flooded that much more feed, see what I mean? And they had that much more feed for them to eat on. And it really helped a lot, I thought. But those ponds do go sour. And I think maybe, now I stocked one up there last year, and I forget, I think I spent around $50 for the fish, and I never caught a trout out of it. Now I think if I'd have put brown trout in, or rainbow trout, I think the water was warm, because you could look up 3/4 of a mile and see one dam right after the other. Well, that's a lot of exposure, and I think the water was probably too warm, and I should have tested it before I put them in. But I may try it again, I don't know. But it was we had quite an experience there with wildwood fishing was that good. I went over fishing on mine one day, and there was a fella, I started getting ready to fish. He said, "I suppose you know you're fishing on posted land, don't you?" And I said, "I didn't see any posters." Well, he said, "It's posted." And I said, "I don't think he'd care if I fished a few minutes." He says, "They mean just what they say." Well, I said, "I'm going to take a chance on it." So I started fishing. And he didn't like it because I was fishing too close to him. And there was a fella came along, 10, 15 minutes afterwards, and he called me by name, and I never seen that fellow since. He left. I don't know why he would do that to you. I didn't ask him to leave.
He didn't know you were the one that posted the land.
I didn't post it.
You didn't?
It wasn't posted.
Oh, he's just telling you that.
Yeah. But he was a fella, I asked him where he was from, he said he's from Fulton. But there's nothing to see 35, 40 different fishermen in there at that time, because it was an ideal spot to fish in.
And he just didn't want you fishing near him, huh?
No, but he thought those posters meant just what they said, and I told him I didn't see any, but.
And you were fishing on your own land anyway.
Yeah, I didn't tell him that. No, I never saw him afterwards either. But there was one thing, a coppersmith that worked here for the Keystone, and he got $72 a week. Now that's a lot of money those days, because the average wage was $22.50 a week. And after I went to work at the gas station, I used to sell him gasoline. And he stopped one night to get gas, and we put it in reverse in order to stop the car. He didn't have any brakes. He had a new Hudson. And I said, "Why don't you drive it over the pit and I'll tighten those brakes up a little bit?" Oh, he said, "Took a load of liquor in yesterday to Buffalo and got along all right." And what he was doing, there was a party on the hill that made moonshine up there, one of the jobbers. And he'd bring it out to the edge of the woods, and this fellow would pick it up and he'd sell it different places. And that night, on his way back to Swampus Mills, it was real foggy. And they straightened the road since then, but he had to go by the hotel there and turn over and then go back down across Fish Creek. You can see the old road there yet. And he got, I don't know how fast he was going, but anyway, they had a big log laid there to keep people from going in the river. And he hit that fast enough so that it upended, and he landed in Fish Creek and drowned. And I've always kind of felt I should have been a little more forceful about fixing those brakes, I guess.